I was at a family dinner a few weeks ago, and my uncle, let's call him David, was talking. David used to run a small manufacturing business. It's gone now. He was explaining with this mix of anger and almost, well, relief why he felt the country was finally waking up. He talked about elites who sold him out, people who cared more about international agreements than the people in his own town. His daughter, she was just back from a university program in Brussels, tried to argue. She brought up GDP, open markets, the necessity of global cooperation, all these abstract systems. And Dave just looked at her, not even really angry, but with this kind of sad finality. He said, "That's all well and good, but those things don't care about us." What was fascinating and, yeah, a little chilling was that they weren't really having an argument. They were speaking two completely different languages, operating from two totally different maps of the world. One was talking about liberal rules and, economic models. The other, betrayal, identity, and this deep foundational sense of loss. That conversation, well, it's the one that's happening everywhere now. And it's not just talk. It's actually redrawing the entire political map.
And that right there, that's exactly what we need to dive into today. We're looking right into that central conflict, this intense, friction-filled space between those rational economic calculations, that's the language of David's daughter, and the deeply embedded emotional, cultural grievances, David's language. This isn't just about, different policy preferences. It's way deeper. It's a profound rupture in how people even define what success looks like for their community, for their country.
Exactly. We're looking at how this fundamental tension, this language of loss, is, well, powering the global rise of illiberal populism. And to really get it, to truly understand this phenomenon, we have to move past the simple news headlines and actually analyze the mechanics of the shift. How does it work?
Right. So our deep dive today is kind of structured around three crucial pillars. First, we really need to fully understand the cultural and economic roots of this split. We'll focus mainly on the U.S. context here, just to define precisely what's driving this discontent, especially among the working class.
Okay, makes sense. And second,
we'll look at what happens when these leaders actually gain power. We'll analyze how that rhetoric of betrayal translates into systematic institutional erosion. We'll examine the detailed blueprint provided by Hungary under the Fidesz government. It's quite a case study.
Right, the playbook, so to speak. And the third pillar.
And finally, pillar 3, we'll study the paradoxical economic strategies these nationalist governments use. They're walking this kind of tightrope, managing to survive, sometimes even thrive, by balancing aggressive economic nationalism against, well, surprising elements of neoliberal pragmatism. We'll compare the contrasting paths of Hungary and Turkey to see how this plays out in practice. It's really an exploration of political science, cultural anxiety, and economic maneuvering, all wrapped into one fascinating, if worrying, package.
Okay, so let's begin with that engine, the deep-seated emotional and cultural side of things. When we look at the national mood, especially in the U.S. context, it's definitely not one of, casual optimism. It feels defined by a sense of foreboding almost.
That's absolutely key. You look at focus group data, and the prevailing national mood is repeatedly described using words like worried, nervous, anxious, tense. This level of collective stress, it goes far beyond just cyclical economic dips. It really speaks to a kind of systemic dread about the country's direction and, crucially, about one's own place within it.
And this anxiety, it translates directly into this feeling of political abandonment, doesn't it? It's that corrosive conviction of being actively forgotten, or maybe even worse, deliberately sold out by policymakers in Washington.
The direct testimony we have is so powerful. I mean, think of that Arizona woman who felt she just had to speak up, saying, that's who has been forgotten today. Ordinary people who work hard aren't rich, but aren't at the bottom of the pile either. This isn't just a plea for, say, more government assistance. It's a fundamental demand for respect and recognition. It's about dignity.
Yeah, exactly. And the sense of betrayal cuts really deep, even through traditional party loyalties. The source material highlights this powerful example, the male car worker in Michigan. Identifies as a union guy through and through, right? Yet he states very plainly that he feels no one speaks up for people like him anymore.
In this demographic, they used to be the bedrock of the center-left coalition. The fact that the economic policies implemented by policymakers in Washington, whatever the rhetoric used to justify them, were perceived as not aligning with the interests of the working class. Well, that represents a profound, multi-cycle strategic failure for the center-left. They basically created the vacuum that the populist right was only too eager to fill.
This is where it gets really fascinating, I think. Our sources draw this crucial distinction. The anxiety fueling populism isn't purely economic. It seems like cultural fear is actually the more potent, the more binding driver, even across different income levels.
We have to unpack this cultural backlash carefully. When you poll white working-class Americans, an overwhelming majority, 68%, express concern that the U.S. is in danger of losing its culture and identity. I mean, that is a foundational level of fear that goes way beyond a bad quarterly earnings report.
And then you compare that 68% figure to white college-educated Americans, and the cultural chasm just becomes this huge gulf. Only 41% of that group shared the same level of concern about cultural loss. It really proves we're dealing with two sort of divergent realities here. One group feels their entire way of life is actively disappearing, and the other sees change as maybe inevitable or even positive.
And we can try to, unpack what drives that cultural fear. It isn't just about policy disagreements. It's about status and recognition, I think. Historically, the white working class held a pretty central, maybe even privileged place in the narrative of American identity. As demographic shifts happen, as social norms change, many feel this profound loss of that traditional status and respect. The culture they grew up with, the values they hold dear, they feel sidelined or even actively criticized by what they see as the dominant coastal, university-educated culture.
And religion just deepens this cleavage, doesn't it? The anxiety is particularly sharp among white working-class evangelical Protestants. Almost 4 out of 5 of them, 79%, express this fear of cultural loss.
Now, contrast that 79% with the significantly lower 56% among the religiously unaffiliated working class. This suggests that for a large, very influential portion of the populist base, identity and culture are intrinsically tied to these deep-seated religious and moral values. Values they feel are not just being ignored, but are actively under sustained attack. The political fight, for them, becomes almost a spiritual one.
There's also this striking generational divide on how urgent this cultural change feels. When you survey white working-class Americans aged 50 and over, a huge 79% feel a need to protect the American way of life right now.
Yeah, but then you look at those under 50, and that figure drops quite significantly down to 52%.
Yeah.
So the older demographic views this cultural anxiety, this defense of traditional identity, with far greater, almost desperate urgency. They seem to see themselves as maybe the last line of defense against what they perceive as inevitable decline.
And this level of, existential anxiety leads directly to the attraction of that rule breaker leader figure. Support for a candidate willing to defy convention, to openly break the rules, it's strikingly high. It's somewhere between 58% and 60% among the white working class.
And what's truly remarkable here, and it really confirms that cultural driver, is that support for this type of leader is not correlated with the respondents' current financial shape. Whether they reported feeling financially secure or struggling, it just didn't move the needle on their desire for a disruptive leader.
Wow, that feels like the ultimate proof that this is a political and cultural grievance looking for political vengeance, rather than just an economic cry for help. They don't just want to raise, they want to shake up the system that they feel disrespected them.
Exactly, and that support is overwhelmingly correlated with underlying authoritarian leanings. 2/3, a full 67% of white working-class Americans with an authoritarian orientation agreed that the country needs a leader willing to break the rules.
Yeah.
Compare that to only 39% of autonomous voters. So for this highly anxious, culturally driven segment, the 2016 election wasn't just another election cycle. Nearly half, 49%, viewed it as the literal last chance to stop America's decline.
So the illiberal mandate, it's built on this perfect storm, economic frustration that translates into a sense of betrayal, coupled with a profound, urgent cultural anxiety, particularly among older, religious, white working-class voters who feel their status is slipping away.
Which brings us right back to the center-left's massive strategic failure. They just kept hemorrhaging these working-class voters because their policies, and maybe even more crucially their rhetoric, failed completely to address this foundational feeling of betrayal and loss. They were speaking the language of GDP, while their former voters were speaking the language of dignity.
And our sources suggest that reversing this isn't about minor tweaks. It requires fundamental strategic shifts designed to speak the language that, David understands. They outline 5 core shifts needed for the center-left's renewal.
The first one is absolutely paramount, putting material interests first. The whole agenda has to be reoriented around working Americans' material interest and, importantly, mainstream social values. This means addressing urgent, immediate problems, wages, cost of living, job security, rather than what the source calls the post-material preoccupations of progressive elites.
Let's pause on that phrase, post-material preoccupations. What exactly are we talking about there? Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, sure. It's a term from political science. It basically describes this shift in values that tends to happen once basic material needs, food, shelter, safety, are met. So for many university-educated, often wealthier voters, concerns might shift away from, do I have a job? Or can I afford health care? Towards issues like, say, environmental preservation, more abstract identity concerns, or global human rights. Now, while these are clearly important issues to a working-class voter who's maybe struggling with medical debt or stagnant wages, these concerns can feel distant, maybe elitist, or sometimes even actively hostile to their community's immediate survival needs.
Got it. So the political agenda needs to be anchored firmly in the kitchen table economics that directly affect voters' daily lives.
Absolutely. And the second shift follows directly from this, offering urgent change, not reflexively defending the status quo. Voters who feel forgotten by Washington, they're crying out for fundamental change, not just incremental policy adjustments. Defending existing programs can actually be seen as out of touch, whereas an aggressive call for reform against the system, against the elites, is highly resonant.
Okay. Third, they have to deliver tangible proof points. We're talking micro-level local changes.
Right. Exactly. Improving local healthcare access, maybe reducing prescription drug costs or securing local infrastructure investment. Those things matter far more to these voters than abstract macroeconomic growth statistics or hitting some distant process target in Washington. Politicians need to be messengers of concrete, visible, local change that reinforces the idea that government can actually work for them.
The fourth point tackles that deep cultural anxiety directly. Cultural moderation.
The advice here is pretty explicit. Champion common sense fairness and actively reject the highly divisive identity politics and what's perceived as illiberal left rhetoric. That rhetoric is often seen by these voters as kind of hectoring and overly critical of traditional culture. And crucially, cultural moderation also means standing for order. That includes tackling illegal immigration and restoring the perception of border security. This approach validates the cultural anxieties about national stability, but without abandoning core democratic values.
Makes sense. And finally, the fifth shift is about reclaiming national belonging. The center-left can't just cede patriotism or national identity to the political right.
No, they can't.
Yeah.
It needs to rally around a politics of national belonging that emphasizes the shared liberal and democratic political values that citizens have in common, the common purpose, rather than focusing solely on tribal differences or maybe marginalized identities. These five shifts, taken together, they represent the strategic roadmap for trying to bridge that colossal gap between David's map of cultural loss and his daughter's map of liberal abstraction.
Okay, so we've established the popular mandate, that language of loss, the desire for a rule breaker.
Yeah.
Now let's shift gears and cross the Atlantic to see what happens when that kind of leader gets power and starts, executing the will of that mandate. Hungary, under Viktor Orbán and his Fidesz party, really provides the clearest, almost canonical blueprint for systematically dismantling liberal democracy from within, using basically legal and constitutional means.
This is such a critical case study because it shows exactly how a democratic system can be hollowed out without, tanks rolling in the streets. The process is incremental, it's legalistic, and it's very systematic. And the primary target naturally had to be the checks and balances that guard against absolute power, specifically the independence of the judiciary.
Okay, let's start with how they centralized power. Fidesz got this 2/3 supermajority in parliament, right? And they moved immediately to create the National Judicial Office, the NJO. How did this one body suddenly concentrate so much power?
Well, the NJO fundamentally altered the entire landscape. It basically stripped power away from the National Council of Justice, which was traditionally a self-governing body of judges, and placed enormous administrative power in the hands of a single person, the NJO president. This one individual controlled judicial appointments, transfers, case assignments, even the budgetary allocation for the whole court system. Total administrative control.
And the political control was just baked right into the appointment process itself.
Exactly. The NJO president is appointed by the parliament, which, as you said, Fidesz completely controlled with its supermajority. And we also saw an immediate and, frankly, glaring conflict of interest when the very first NGO president, Tünde Hando, turned out to be the wife of Josef Schaar, who was a leading Fidesz member of the European Parliament.
Wait, hang on. So the person responsible for administratively controlling the entire supposedly independent court system was directly related, married, to a major ruling party official. What was the practical effect of that?
Well, the risk, as critics immediately warned, was essentially eliminating the principle of the lawful judge. Because the NGO president had the power to transfer judges or reassign cases, supposedly for administrative efficiency, critics feared that politically sensitive cases, think corruption charges against allies or constitutional challenges to Fidesz laws, could just be moved to judges deemed more favorable to the government. It effectively risked eliminating impartiality and independence, especially in high-stakes cases.
Okay, so beyond controlling the flow of cases, they engineered this massive, immediate change in who the judges actually were. Tell us about the retirement purge.
Yeah, this was a really blunt political instrument, but it was cleverly cloaked in administrative reform language. In 2011, the government passed something called the Transitional Act that dramatically lowered the mandatory retirement age for judges from 70 all the way down to 62. And this was effective almost immediately on January 1st, 2012.
Wow. What was the scale of that change? How many judges were affected?
It was huge. This sudden move forced 274 senior judges. These were the most experienced, often the most independent voices, including high-ranking appeals court presidents, into mandatory early retirement. It was basically a rapid, wholesale clearance of jurists who might have been resistant to Fidesz's big constitutional changes.
Now, the EU Court of Justice did step in later and rule that this was unlawful age discrimination, didn't it?
It did, yes. But you could argue the political objective had already been largely achieved by then. While the government subsequently introduced measures supposedly to comply with the ruling, they were quite tactical. They failed to fully reinstate many of the affected judges, particularly those whose senior positions and court leadership roles had already been filled with new appointees, often people with ties to the ruling party. The judiciary was, for all intents and purposes, purged of its old guard opposition.
So once they controlled the courts administratively and installed loyalists, they moved to clip the wings of the highest judicial authority, the Constitutional Court, the CC. How do they restrict the CC's power?
There were two major legal restraints they put in place that fundamentally neutered the CC's ability to act as a real check on executive power. The first was limiting its jurisdiction over budget laws.
Explain this constraint, because it sounds really technical, but I suspect it was deeply impactful.
Oh, incredibly impactful. The rule essentially stated that if the state debt exceeded 50% of GDP, which it pretty much consistently did, the CC could only review budget acts for violations of a very narrow, specific list of fundamental rights. We're talking things like the right to life, human dignity, freedom of religion, protection of personal data. A very short list.
And what did excluding everything else achieve for Fidesz?
It was quite ingenious politically. It completely excluded the court's ability to review fiscal policy based on classic liberal principles like, say, property rights or economic equality or even privacy concerns related to taxes. This effectively immunized vast critical areas of the state's fiscal policy from any constitutional scrutiny. It gave the government massive fiscal freedom to implement their, frankly, unorthodox economic policy without judicial interference.
Okay.
This was absolutely critical for their stated goal of achieving macroeconomic sovereignty.
Okay. And the second key restriction concerned public access to justice, limiting who could even bring a case forward.
That was the abolition of what's called actio popularis. Previously, ordinary citizens, or importantly, non-governmental organizations, NGOs, could initiate constitutional reviews in the public interest, even if they hadn't suffered direct personal harm themselves. This was the main mechanism by which civil society groups could challenge questionable legislation.
So by abolishing actio popularis, they essentially silenced organized civil society critics, or at least made it much harder for them. What kind of cases could NGOs no longer bring easily?
Well, they could no longer initiate these broad challenges to laws concerning general public issues, think environmental degradation from a new policy, or systemic human rights issues affecting a group, or maybe challenges related to public finance transparency. Now, they had to prove direct personal injury. This significantly restricted public interest litigation, removing one of the last real avenues for external legal challenge to Fidesz's legislative agenda.
And finally, when the Constitutional Court did manage to strike down a problematic law, Fidesz didn't even hesitate to use their supermajority to just bypass the ruling entirely.
This is the absolute defining characteristic of the illiberal blueprint, using the law to effectively destroy the spirit of the law. The Fourth Amendment, which they adopted in March 2013, was basically a constitutional sledgehammer. It just flat out reversed previous CC rulings. For instance, the court had struck down a law criminalizing homelessness, arguing quite reasonably that punishing people who have no choice but to live in a public area violated basic human dignity.
And the government's response was?
To enshrine the criminalization of homelessness directly into the Constitution itself. Just write it into the foundational law, rendering the CC's ruling completely meaningless. They did the same thing with restricting the definition of family constitutionally to just marriage and parent-child relationships, specifically excluding same-sex relationships and cohabitants, thereby solidifying policies the court had previously found objectionable.
Wow. It really shows the regime viewed the Constitutional Court not as an equal branch of government, but purely as a temporary political obstacle that could just be overridden with raw parliamentary power whenever needed.
Precisely. And this systematic erosion didn't stop at the courts, of course. It was extended to media freedom, which is obviously crucial for any kind of public accountability.
How did the government manage to gain control over the media landscape? Was it similar tactics?
Very similar. They did it primarily through regulatory capture. The media laws adopted back in 2010 established this powerful media council under the umbrella of the National Media and Info Communications Authority. This council was granted really extensive power over content regulation, the ability to levy huge fines, and most critically, the power to award broadcast licenses.
But just like the NJO for the judiciary, this body lacked genuine political independence, right?
Completely by design. The 4 members of the Media Council are appointed by the parliament. And surprise, surprise, their composition directly mirrored the Fidesz supermajority. Furthermore, the president of the overall media authority was appointed directly by the prime minister for a non-renewable 9-year term, effectively insulating the leadership from any subsequent election results for nearly a decade. The Council of Europe raised very serious concerns that this whole structure simply lacked even the appearance of independence and impartiality.
And the result was the state bureaucracy being weaponized against critical voices. The Klub Radio example is probably the most notorious one.
Yeah, Klub Radio was a prominent, independent, often critical radio station. Starting around 2010, they just found themselves in this continuous, drawn-out legal and regulatory battle with the Media Council. Despite repeatedly winning license tenders based on merit and even winning subsequent court rulings in their favor, proving they were often the best administrative choice, the Media Council just continuously found technical reasons, manufactured delays, and threw up bureaucratic obstacles to prevent them from securing the necessary operating license for their main frequency.
So it wasn't like a sudden, dramatic shutdown. It was more like a slow, agonizing process of regulatory denial, designed to silence a critical voice without appearing overtly authoritarian, just lead them dry.
Exactly. Death by 1,000 regulatory cuts. And then, to ensure a wider chilling effect on any critical speech across the board, they introduced new, deliberately vague constitutional provisions.
The provision prohibiting speech that violates the dignity of the Hungarian nation or the dignity of any national, ethnic, or religious minority group.
That's the one. Article 5 of the Fourth Amendment introduced this. Now, it sounds kind of noble on the surface, right? Protecting dignity. But in practice, its broad, extremely vague nature was immediately criticized by rights groups for creating a very high risk of arbitrary state interference with freedom of expression. I mean, if a journalist or an artist criticized a government policy deemed central to the Hungarian nation, whatever that means, they could risk censorship or penalties under this provision. It's very open to abuse.
And finally, we saw these societal controls extending right into the lives of vulnerable populations, again, using the law to define who belongs and who doesn't, who gets rights and who doesn't.
Yes. We already mentioned the restrictive family definitions and the constitutional override to decriminalize homelessness. And critically, they also restricted the fundamental right of political participation for those deemed sort of socially unproductive or problematic.
Specifically targeting those with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities who had been deprived of legal capacity.
Correct. The new constitution explicitly restricted their voting rights. The UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities flagged this immediately, urging Hungary to review the legislation to ensure that all persons with disabilities retain the right to vote on an equal basis with others. These measures, when you take them all together, controlling the courts, crushing independent media, restricting the rights of vulnerable groups, they demonstrate a comprehensive, quite sophisticated legalistic strategy that effectively replaces liberal democracy with an institutionalized illiberal state.
Okay, so this institutional destruction is one side of the coin. The other side, and arguably the more complex one, is the question of survival. How does an illiberal government like this actually sustain itself economically, especially when it's often openly hostile to foreign capital and global liberal institutions? This brings us to what you called the imperfect balance, the pragmatic, sometimes contradictory economic policies they pursue.
Yeah, the Fidesz government's aim in Hungary was pretty clear. They wanted to create an illiberal alternative that allows for political control and increased national ownership, specifically by intervening in the market to benefit national insiders, people loyal to the regime, over foreign outsiders. They were absolutely determined to end what they saw as foreign economic dominance.
Okay, let's examine the nationalist toolkit they deployed in Hungary, starting with taxes and nationalization. How did that work?
Well, the taxing mechanism was highly targeted. They didn't just levy general taxes across the board. They imposed these special, supposedly temporary, but actually long-lasting crisis taxes specifically aimed at foreign-dominated sectors, primarily banking, energy, retail, and telecommunications. The strategic goal was clearly to lower the profitability of these foreign-owned enterprises quite substantially.
And that lowered profitability presumably made nationalization, or pushing them out, far more feasible.
Exactly. Reduced profitability made assets cheaper or maybe just easier to acquire through regulatory pressure. Sure. The most dramatic example, undoubtedly, was the renationalization, or maybe appropriation is a better word, of the private pension system back in 2010. This was a massive political and financial coup. It secured something like $14 billion USD for the state coffers almost overnight, and that single move immediately decreased the country's official debt-to-GDP ratio by 5 percentage points. Huge impact.
Wow, $14 billion. That's a huge immediate financial boost for the government.
Absolutely crucial. And furthermore, they aggressively increased state asset ownership across the board from about 11% in 2007 up to 16.5% by 2016. They specifically targeted strategic sectors like energy and banking to ensure greater Hungarian and therefore Fidesz-aligned control. This was pure economic nationalism aimed at achieving state dominance in key areas.
But hang on, if they're taxing foreign businesses so aggressively and effectively nationalizing huge chunks of the pension system, wouldn't that just scare away all foreign direct investment for good? Wouldn't it crash the currency? How did they manage to make this look like pragmatism, not just, well, pure theft?
That's the tightrope walk we mentioned. That's the necessary ideological contradiction they had to manage. To offset the very negative message sent by taxing foreign entities and seizing pensions, Fidesz simultaneously implemented classic, quite aggressive neoliberal incentives, but aimed at the broader domestic economy.
Okay, give us the specifics on those incentives. What did they do?
Well, they moved very quickly to replace the existing progressive income tax system, which had rates going from 17% up to 32%, with a single flat 16% rate. Now, this was obviously a substantial benefit to higher earners and entrepreneurs within Hungary, and crucially, they also dramatically lowered corporate taxes, cutting the rate from 19% all the way down to just 10%, one of the lowest in Europe.
So on one hand, they're saying, we hate foreign interference and we're going to tax foreign banks until they weep. But on the other hand, they're basically saying, but if you are a domestic business or a wealthy Hungarian, we'll give you massive tax breaks. Is that the gist?
That's pretty much it. The messaging was perfectly clear and very selective. We are anti-globalist dominance, but we are very much pro-business for the national insiders, meaning the loyal domestic business elite and the desired skilled workforce they wanted to attract or keep. This provided a necessary economic safety valve and kept parts of the economy humming.
And this selectivity was complemented by this, well, surprisingly savvy approach to macroeconomic sovereignty that gave them political capital, especially internationally.
Yeah, their approach here was brilliant in its pragmatism, you have to admit. They used that $14 billion pension windfall, in part, to pay off the country's outstanding IMF debt early, back in 2013. Now, that was an incredibly powerful narrative point, a symbol of restored economic self-rule and national prestige. A clear win for the anti-elite, anti-globalist agenda.
And despite all their unorthodox fiscal moves internally, they continued to play by Brussels rules where it really counted, didn't they?
Critically, yes. They rigidly maintained the budget deficit below the EU's 3% Maastricht criteria, pretty much consistently right up until the pandemic hit in 2020. This fiscal stability was their masterstroke, really. It secured crucial EU funding totaling around $25 billion between 2014 and 2020, which essentially financed many of their national projects and infrastructure spending. And simultaneously, maintaining those relatively low debt and deficit figures kept the country's default risk perceived as low by international bond markets. They could still borrow internationally at reasonable rates.
So they managed to reject the authority of the IMF, boast about a nationalist economic agenda, all while leveraging massive EU structural funds and maintaining the basic trust of global bond markets. They effectively utilized the structures of the liberal international system to help fund their illiberal state project at home.
That's exactly it. And the final piece of their domestic economic puzzle was the big ideological push for a work-based society. This was also a key tool for social control.
Right. This policy sounded like it was designed to reward one segment of society while punishing another, defining who counts as the productive citizen.
It was highly selective, absolutely.
Yeah.
The social policy was explicitly designed to force high employment rates, which did reach 75.3% by 2019, a significant increase. But the system was quite punitive towards the unemployed, often forcing them into short-term, low-skill, low-wage public works programs. Meanwhile, they provided substantial incentives, particularly generous tax credits, targeted specifically at working families with children. Encouraging births among the right kind of families was part of it, too. The labor code was also reformed to reduce job security and significantly curb union power, which obviously pleased employers and likely boosted those job creation statistics.
So, for Fidesz, it seems the nationalist ideology dictated who to reward and who to punish the working, fertile Hungarian family is in. The unemployed person, the foreign investor, maybe the Romani person is out. And then they use neoliberal tools like deregulation and flat taxes to keep the overall economy ticking over enough to maintain power.
It's a fundamentally pragmatic authoritarianism, I'd say, not a purely ideological one. The economic policy mix is clearly designed primarily for political survival and consolidation of power, not necessarily for adherence to any consistent economic theory.
Okay, now let's turn to Turkey's AKP under President Erdogan, because that provides a really key contrast, doesn't it? While Fidesz somehow managed a kind of stability through contradiction, the AKP's shift seems to have led to genuine economic instability.
Yes, the AKP's trajectory really highlights how this illiberal turn can unravel economic stability if not managed carefully. They didn't actually start out as fuse economic nationalists. They began more as neoliberal populists. Their initial decade in power, roughly 2002 to 2011, was marked by pretty strong fiscal discipline and mass privatization, largely following the IMF-backed Jervis reform program. And that initially yielded strong growth and reduced public debt.
But the party transitioned quite dramatically after 2011, shifting the economic rhetoric firmly towards nationalism.
Yes, exactly. They moved from that neoliberal populism to a much more pronounced national populism. They adopted the rhetoric of Yerli ve milli, meaning indigenous and national. And in this new worldview, economic pressure, things like capital flight or rising inflation, was increasingly framed not as a result of policy mistakes, but as economic warfare being waged against Turkey by hostile foreign powers and their supposed internal collaborators.
And the most immediate and perhaps damaging consequence of this nationalist shift was the dramatic erosion of the central bank's independence.
This was really the point of no return for macroeconomic stability in Turkey. President Erdogan developed this highly unorthodox, very personal conviction that high interest rates actually cause inflation, completely contradicting centuries of established economic theory and practice. This led to continuous, intense political pressure on the central bank, the TCMB, to cut interest rates even as inflation was already soaring.
What was the result of the TCMB losing its ability to act independently to raise rates when needed?
Well, the predictable outcome, unfortunately. Continuous, often dramatic, currency depreciation and soaring, persistent inflation after around 2013. This pushed Turkey into recurring cycles of currency and debt crises. So unlike Hungary, where the shift to nationalism was for a long time economically managed quite pragmatically, in Turkey, the pursuit of sovereignty over monetary policy led directly to severe instability and plummeting investor confidence.
The political economy of control also extended to rewarding allies and punishing opponents within the domestic private sector, similar to Fidesz, but perhaps even more overt.
Yes. The use of reward and punishment mechanisms became highly institutionalized, particularly in the construction sector. Construction firms that were politically connected to the AKP were immensely rewarded with major public procurement contracts, roads, bridges, airports, hospitals. So much so that 5 specific Turkish firms consistently ranked globally among the very top recipients of huge infrastructure procurement contracts worldwide. Meanwhile, perceived political enemies, especially in the media or other influential sectors, faced massive, often politically motivated, tax audits, crippling fines, and even asset seizures. The punishment levied against the influential Dozan Media Group is a classic example of using regulatory and fiscal power to eliminate economic opposition.
And just like Fidesz in Hungary, the AKP in Turkey made a major public point of avoiding the IMF.
Yes. This point is absolutely central to the populist narrative of sovereignty for both regimes. Both Fidesz and the AKP successfully paid off their existing IMF debts and then very proudly refused any further IMF assistance or oversight. For the AKP, this rejection became a core narrative point, constantly invoked to bolster the image of national prestige and independence from those perceived global financial overlords. However, because of Turkey's self-inflicted monetary instability, their refusal of IMF help meant they had to rely increasingly on less transparent, often politically conditioned financing from sympathetic countries like Russia, China, and especially Qatar, leading arguably to a new, different set of dependencies.
So this extensive deep dive into illiberal governance, looking at the systematic dismantling of institutions in Hungary and that economic tightrope walked in both Hungary and Turkey, it really shows us just how potent that language of cultural loss and anti-elite rhetoric is in securing and holding onto political power.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it creates a pretty clear mandate, I think, for liberal and center-left forces who are struggling to hold on to working-class voters. They simply have to match that intensity of grievance with a compelling, accountable economic story of their own. The primary lesson from our research, especially looking at the U.S. context again, is that anti-elite economic messaging works. It resonates, even if many candidates currently seem too timid or maybe too disconnected to use it effectively.
Right. Our sources looks closely at candidate rhetoric in the 2022 U.S. midterm elections, and the findings seem pretty indisputable on the power of that anti-elite communication.
Yeah, they are. Candidates who robustly deployed anti-economic elite messaging, specifically targeting big corporations, billionaires, Wall Street, they were associated with a significantly higher general election vote share. And what's really compelling is the specificity of this success. This kind of rhetoric was robustly associated with roughly a 4 percentage point higher vote share, specifically in highly working class districts.
Wow. A 4-point swing is enormous in a tight race. I mean, that's easily the difference between winning and losing marginal districts, the very places where elections are often decided. Yet you're saying very few candidates actually employed this strategy.
Astonishingly few, it seems. Less than 20% of the candidates analyzed employed these kinds of economic populist talking points targeting economic elites, and even fewer, like 5% or less, actually campaigned on bold progressive economic policies, like, say, a federal jobs guarantee or a $15 minimum wage, even though polling often shows support for these ideas. The data suggests these policies could be popular, yet candidates, especially maybe those vying for competitive races, largely fail to sufficiently connect with voters' deep economic anxiety using this proven anti-elite framing.
And this takes us directly to what our sources identify as the supply problem in democratic politics, right? The idea that the candidates themselves often don't reflect the working class they claim they want to represent.
This is a critical structural deficit, it appears. Only about 1 in 5, just 20% of the Democratic candidates analyzed had ever held any kind of working class job in their past. That means jobs typically requiring manual labor or non-college level skills. And if you narrow that down to look at those candidates who are exclusively working class throughout their careers before running, that figure drops to a tiny 2.3%.
And how does that 20% or 2.3% compare to the actual population they're meant to represent?
Well, it trails tremendously behind. I mean, depending on how exactly you define the metric, the working class makes up anywhere from, say, 47% to maybe even 67% of the general U.S. population.
Mm-hmm.
So if only 20%, or really 2%, of your candidates have ever experienced that life firsthand, there's bound to be a fundamental disconnect in shared experience, and that almost inevitably translates into a failure of rhetorical resonance. David, back in our opening story, he senses instinctively that the person arguing for GDP growth from Washington probably doesn't actually understand his world, his struggles.
And those few working class candidates who do try to run, they seem to struggle immensely early on, suggesting the political system itself kind of filters them out.
Yeah, they absolutely seem to face a significant filter effect, especially in the primary elections. Candidates with working class experience generally fared worse in primaries. Now, this isn't necessarily due to voter bias against them. It likely stems more from significant structural barriers. Things like lack of established donor networks, the sheer time commitment required for full-time campaigning, which is hard if you're working shifts, and just the huge organizational expense needed to compete against candidates who are often backed by wealthy professional networks.
But when they did manage to make it past that difficult primary filter and actually get into the general election, how did they perform then?
They performed comparably well, actually. The data showed very little downside risk for the party in fielding candidates with working-class backgrounds in the general election itself. This really reinforces the idea that the problem isn't necessarily voter resistance to these candidates. It's more likely the party's internal process, the financial structure, the organizational gatekeeping that is inadvertently screening out the very candidates who might possess the experiential authenticity and the resonant rhetoric needed to reclaim working-class support.
So the overall conclusion for the center-left seems pretty sobering. The failure to reach working-class voters isn't just about having a policy platform that's maybe too timid on economics. It's also about a fundamental failure of representation and a failure of rhetorical strategy. A failure to match the right political language with the right kinds of messengers.
It really seems to be a failure to match that potent language of loss with an equally powerful language of anti-elite accountability. Reclaiming support in those working class, often rural and white, non-college educated districts, the precise demographic where populist leaders draw so much of their energy, it seems to require a much bolder embrace of economic populism, especially that anti-elite rhetoric, and also a commitment to address deep-seated economic anxiety through tangible local proof points that show government can actually deliver for them. #Tech6. Conclusion and final thought.
So what we've seen today, really, tracking from those anxious focus groups in the U.S. through the meticulous constitutional purges in Hungary and looking at the often chaotic nationalization in Turkey, it's this fundamental tension that seems to define so much of modern politics. The illiberal shift happening worldwide appears sustained by these two seemingly contradictory but actually mutually reinforcing forces.
That's right. On the one hand, you have this intense cultural and psychological grievance. That profound, pervasive sense of betrayal and loss felt by significant segments of the electorate, particularly those whose traditional status and economic stability feel eroded by globalization and cultural change. They feel their identity, their way of life has been undermined by distant, often liberal elites.
And then on the other hand, you have these illiberal nationalist governments like Fidesz and the AKP, which manage to sustain their political control not just through ideology or repression, but through a highly selective, often quite pragmatic economic policy mix. They deploy heterodox nationalism against foreign actors when it suits them, but they also ensure just enough stability like Hungary's relatively low budget deficit for years or Turkey's early years of growth, or pushing high employment metrics to limit external supervision and keep international debt risk manageable, at least for a time. They use pragmatic means to achieve fundamentally illiberal ends.
And these governments pursuing illiberal nationalism, they've demonstrated a hard reality, haven't they? That political control, when combined with strategically managed economic stability, or even just the perception of stability, and a powerful narrative that names and punishes the designated elite, can absolutely secure and sustain power, even in the face of international disapproval and quite heterodox policy choices.
And this brings us back, I think, one final time to David and his daughter, and they're two completely different languages, they're two different maps. Perhaps the most profound insight from this deep dive today is that for that segment of the population driven by that foundational sense of loss, the political act of naming and punishing the elite or the outsider, whether that's global markets, foreign companies, internal political opponents, whoever, that act itself is a more resonant act of responsiveness than any abstract liberal economic model could ever possibly be. It feels like an act of restoration, perhaps even of dignity.
Which leaves us with the enduring challenge, doesn't it? How can liberal political forces offer that necessary sense of belonging, that powerful anti-elite accountability, and the real economic change working people are demanding? How can they do that without resorting to illiberal means themselves or abandoning core democratic values in the process? It seems to require a fundamental strategic and rhetorical pivot, one that demonstrates convincingly that liberal democracy can, in fact, hold elites accountable when they wrong the people, and that it can truly stand for the common material good, not just abstract principles.